It's hard for me to believe that for nearly 50 years I have been a minister of the gospel. I have had hundreds of situations that have blessed my heart and hundreds that have broken my heart. When my heart is broken most is when I have a couple sitting in my office, a man and a woman married to each other, who are having difficulty communicating. You listen to his side of the story, you get one story. You listen to her side of the story, it's completely the opposite. And we're placed in the middle as ministers or agents of the gospel to try to discern exactly what the truth is. Hi, my name is Dr. Chuck Betters. I am with MARKINC Ministries, the founder of MARKINC Ministries, a ministry designed to answer tough questions. I want to encourage you to visit our website, markinc.org, and there you will find a host of resources on a variety of topics. And these resources we're adding resources almost every day. And I want to encourage you to ask us the questions, the tough questions of life that you're facing, so that we can be answering questions people are actually asking. One of those such questions is this. A writer says, "My husband and I are always fighting. How should we communicate when communication breaks down?" Well, most counselors will say that the biggest problem in a marriage that causes the greatest pain is the breakdown of communication. But how are we to communicate? When we understand our spouse, we understand that he or she is made up of a body, that's this thing, a soul, which is the mind, the will, the emotions, the intellect, and a spirit, that part of you that has been created in the image and likeness of God. Now, a marriage can exist and actually be strong if the body and the soul are functioning properly. In other words, if there is a significant acceptance of each other physically and emotionally, you can still have a good marriage. But you can never have a marriage based upon what the biblical architecture is and design that God has for marriage without a spiritual union between two people. You see, if my wife is created in the image and likeness of God, that is her spirit. And if I am created in the image and likeness of God, that is my spirit, then that spiritual union, that brother-sister relationship, which is much higher than marriage itself, that brother-sister relationship between a man and his wife, between a wife and her husband, is what solidifies the core of the marriage. I like to refer to it as the pit of the peach. You have the pit that just holds the peach together. You have the meat of the peach, which is the emotion, the will, the intellect, and you have the skin, which is the outer edge. But without that inner edge, without that inner connection of body, soul, and spirit, there is a lack in that marriage that can never be great because we are not united spiritually. So first of all, I think the most important thing to learn about marriage is that there is a mutual submission of one to the other. Ephesians 5:22. Men like this passage because it says that wives are to submit to their husbands as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Wives like to hear the next part, which says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Be willing to sacrifice for her, even to the point of death. But both couples who have broken down in communication, both the man and the woman who no longer are communicating with each other, have missed the verse that goes ahead of it, which is Ephesians 5:21. It speaks of mutual submission. It says, submit to one another in the fear of God. Or Galatians chapter 6. I want to read this to you because imagine that if you're married to someone where communication has broken down, imagine that both of you adopt the principle of Galatians chapter 6. Imagine if the man and the woman both read this passage and say to themselves, this is what I've got to do to reopen the doors of communication. Galatians 6 says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. But then he says this, keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. That's looking inward. Imagine a man who is looking inward at his own failures, his own transgressions, his own sins in terms of his relationship to his wife. Imagine that his wife is doing the very same thing. You have both people now looking inward, examining that spirit, that inner core, that part that was created in the image and likeness of God, and asking God to reveal their sins. He continues, he says, bear one another's burdens. You know what that's called? That's called other-oriented love. That's called orienting your behavior toward pleasing the other person. Imagine if you were willing as a man to please your wife by looking inward, maybe even saying to her, how can I be a better husband to you? Show me very specific ways in which I can be a better husband to you. And imagine his wife saying the same thing. If the couple is inward, if they're looking inside of themselves, if they're examining their own hearts and have a willingness to bear the burdens of the other person, doors of communication will rapidly come open. He says this, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone, I want you to imagine your last argument that you had where communication broke down, because inevitably this is where the error comes. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one, husband, let each one, wife, let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear their own load. That means very simply, wife, you have the responsibility to bear your responsibilities in the marriage. If you failed, then you have the responsibility to undo those failures. Husband, you have the same responsibility to undo the errors that have broken down the communication. But you can't do that unless you are willing to bear each other's burdens, carry each other's load by looking inward. It will become very encouraging to a man if his wife is looking inward. It will become very encouraging to a woman if her husband is examining his own heart and asking the tough questions of what have I done to break down this communication. When you have two people bent on examining the spiritual condition of their own heart, that pit seed, that core that holds everything else together, that part of you that was created in the image and likeness of God, get me two people committed to that principle, and I guarantee you that communication will begin to open, because ultimately that communication comes from that spiritual relationship of brother and sister to Christ.